You're fine. Hello and welcome to another episode of the SumerSports Show. This is your host, Parker Fleming. I'm back here on the midweek episode, joined finally again by my friend and colleague, Tej Seth. Tej, how are you? Glad to have you back on the show.
Doing great. Yeah, I'm very, very excited for this episode. I think, the guest that we have today is one of our favorite people to talk to. How are you doing, Parker?
Oh, I'm doing great, man. We were just I love a day when we podcast a little earlier because I feel like I was just in like 3 hours of meetings that were boring, and I'm ramping up to be able to get on the show and talk football and talk football. We will today. We are joined by again my friend Cody Alexander of Match Quarters. You might know him as @the_coach_A on Twitter, a defensive guru, a guy who's been super kind and generous with his time to me, talking about football. And I've certainly learned a lot about the game of football browsing his website and his Substack on my lunch breaks or when I'm procrastinating. There's such a great content there about football and defense specifically. So Cody, thanks for joining the show, man. We're really glad to hear from you today. How are you?
Yeah, doing great. Glad to be here. Love talking ball.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Tej, please.
I was just gonna say thanks for joining us. I think like out of all the content that we see on Twitter, between like what you've done, the Art of X show, Match Quarters on Substacks, you even have like books on Amazon that people can get on defense. Like there's so many pieces of content out there, but like I think most people should always make a time to read and watch what you're putting out, because it's really good content.
Thank you.
Let's get into it. I try to keep the intro 2.5, and we're getting right there. So I'm good with my pacing and moving us along here so we can get to the good stuff. Cody, why don't you tell us again, if someone not familiar with your work at all, kind of give us a little bit about your background, a little bit to how you got where you are today, and then kind of what your day-to-day in terms of watching football, creating content, and writing kind of looks like.
Yeah, I never would have thought, if you would have said 10, 15 years ago that this is where I would be leaving college, that I'd be doing this kind of content creation full time, talking about doing just really kind of defensive scheme. I probably would have told you, no, that's not what I wanted. I want to be, I want to be a football coach. I want to be a college football coach. Wanted to do, basically take over the world. And I've written about this. I've talked about this a lot. Is just, you never have full control over your path. My wife and I laugh at each other all the time. Like God makes fun of our ideas and our plans. And so it's like, but I got into a kind of a jam when I was around 30 years old. So about 7 years ago, and I needed to have a creative outlet. I've always been a writer. My English teachers always tried to get me into writing, but I was like, at that time I was like, I'm not going to write the next Harry Potter. So like, that's why would you do that? And so the only way I saw forward was be a history teacher like my dad, coach football like my dad, and then eventually, I'll end up being a college football coach, and that'll just be what it is. And so that's kind of where I started the writing of Match Quarters. I got my start at Baylor, kind of quit my job and moved down to Waco and sat in the office. And I've talked about a story, Phil Bennett, who was generous enough to just ask me who I am and let me kind of pal around. And then the next thing, fast forward 4 weeks into the season, we're playing Texas A&M. And I'm leading the scouting team, and I'm doing the video and doing all that stuff. So it's insane. And it was perfect timing getting in. I had a kid while I was a GA, and so I really needed to make some money. I shot for the moon, tried to get a full-time job. And anybody that's familiar with that business at all knows that's usually not the path that you go down. And so I ended up going back to the high school level, been there for a while, and then kind of Match Quarters took off, and it became a life of its own in the content side of it. And I've just kind of grown it organically. And it got to the point where I was like, you know what, I want to do this full time. And luckily I was able to do that and have been able to sustain that in the past year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I think it's a really interesting journey. It's always cool to hear how people who now do content kind of got into that. And it usually does start with some type of background of being deeply involved in it. Like you were in. So that's like the thing with this for me is like you were doing all this super cool stuff on match quarters, writing these books, and then the big data bowl is happening this past year on offensive linemen and defensive linemen. And I'm looking through the submissions, and all of a sudden your name is attached to one of them. And this is usually, the big data bowl is for people with heavy data scientists background. A couple of years ago, some people who didn't even watch football from Austria ended up winning one of the first big data bowls, and it kind of has spiraled from there. But seeing your name on one of the submissions along with some really other smart people was really cool to see, because you could see in your big datable submission, you were combining your scheme knowledge with the other group members like data analysis ability. So how was kind of that process, and how you guys got to your final submission in that regard?
Yeah, I had no idea. And actually, the first time I ever heard about it, Parker, you had come to me when they were doing coverage. And I don't even know if you remember this. You were kind of toying around with it, and you had mentioned it. So I kind of had an idea of what it was. And then it just fell apart. We both were busy. It ended up not happening. And then I got asked to be part of this. And I wanted to make sure that we were doing something that was applicable. And I think that's kind of the big, coming from the coach side, that's where my feet are squarely supplanted. And then looking at I consider myself analytics friendly. I try and use at least, advanced metrics as much as I possibly can when I do some of these studies that I do. But it was like, I wanted to make it applicable. I wanted to be able to, when you walk into the coaching office and you say, look at this cool thing that we're doing with data, that it's actually applicable. It's not post-op. It's not during the play. Because that's the other thing, is like some of this stuff is like during the play. Well, in the NFL, yeah, they've got a microphone to the quarterback, but that cuts off. And so during the play, it's not like you can. And that's actually coaching wise, and a lot of coaches and really a lot of mental side, anybody that deals with coaching or pedagogy or teaching, you don't want to be command based, right? And during the play even. So that to me was something that I wanted to build. And so it was a really cool experience, and very glad that I did that.
And certainly an interesting submission, looking at kind of how you guys put that together. And again, just kind of combine those two as well. I think that's something that's really hard. I mean, we talk about it almost every week on the podcast. Just a lot of the ideas behind analytics are pretty intuitive to the people making them, but seem pretty obscure to the people that need to implement them on the field and in the play, or in the field of play rather. Do you feel like, Cody, you've seen examples of potentially teams that are doing a good job of kind of marrying analytics and scheme? Do you feel like you have a good sense of what it might take to make that marriage work between an analytics department and a scheme department, as someone who's been kind of on both sides of that fence?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is going to be a general manager or a CEO of football operations, whatever you want to call them, seeing the big picture, and seeing the future, seeing that there needs to be a bridge built, not building an analytics department just because we need an analytics department because everybody else is doing, which is a very NFL thing. I mean, kind of everybody kind of says it's copycat league, but also kind of how can we build a bridge to the coaching side? I think that's where I think the 49ers, I've talked to a couple of their data guys. They've got, they've got some coaches that are data analysts or got former players. I know Tej, when we talked, you mentioned the Jets do have that. Then the Ravens obviously have kind of always been ahead of the curve. I think too, it also depends on the coaching staff. Do you have a coaching staff that is data friendly or analytics friendly, or do you have a coaching staff? And again, in the NFL, and I think that people that are outside of the coaching world don't understand, kind of the NFL is kind of like, it's, to use a term, it's like the mafia, right? Like once you're in, you're a made man, right? Like, and so like you see these guys and they just keep getting recycled. And like, it's very homogeneous. A lot of these guys have either played, they work for, they're related to, I think, you start really digging into some of these head coaches and some of these coaches, you start doing their history. You'll find out, oh, he's married to this guy's daughter, or he's actually the nephew or the, related to this guy. And so to me, I think that there's a few teams that are doing it that always pop up. I think to name another one, the Cleveland Browns tend to be somebody that everybody talks about analytically, but that the biggest problem, and I didn't, again, coming from an outside world view of like, I'm really only coming from the coaching view, going to the Big Data Bowl. The one thing that I really got when we did our submission is that everybody was just blown away about how applicable it was. And so I really felt like we felt really confident going in. Like we really thought we had a really good chance. Now, was the like the data science part of it, was it like cutting edge? No, probably not. But the idea, the actual part of putting it together with the application piece, like I had one guy for work for an NFL team came up to me and he was like jaw on the floor. He was like, I can take this tomorrow, work on it for a day, and I will be able to take this to my offense coordinator, my defense coordinator, and the door won't get slammed on in front of me. So I think it really opened my mind. Then talking to Mike Lopez, who's the head of the data analytics for the NFL, like had a really candid conversation with him about, NFL teams need to understand you don't have to hire an analytics guy, a coder now. You can hire a coder and then pair them with somebody that can go walk into the coaching. And I'm a teacher and I've been a teacher forever. My dad was a teacher. Stories are what are going to sell something. So, and I think that's lost a lot of times in the science and the math. You lose that your story and how you present it. That's what's going to sell it. You may have the best thing in the world, but then if you can't sell it, then you're going to have a hard time. You're going to constantly be knocking heads. And that's where you get the oil, it's all like oil and water with your departments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really love the way that you put all of that. I think, when you are able to put something applicable that can be applied pre-snap to a play and get factored into the game reports, the advanced reports that coaches are getting ahead of time, that's something that I think is like one of the best things that data scientists that work for teams or even doing public work out on the internet, where we know that the teams are lurking and looking at all that stuff. And the storytelling part I think is really good. And we kind of have a question in the chat from Robert Wolf that relates to this. So, this week I was looking a lot at average depth of target and how that relates to passing efficiency. Wrote an article about this on SumerSports.com. And so, when you look at the correlation between average depth of target and EPA per pass per season, the average correlation that we see is positive 0.15. So a slightly, like a moderate correlation, not super strongly correlated, but also not no correlation. 2020, the 2020 season had a correlation of 0.39 between average depth of target and an EPA per pass. It dropped down to 0.15 in 2021. And then in 2022, it was 0.06. So now we're seeing much less of a correlation from 2020 between average depth of target and EPA per pass. And, before I give a lot of my thoughts on this, being someone who looks at defense so heavily, do you think that the majority of this loss in correlation between deeper passes and passing efficiency is coming from these split field coverages, these too high shells that are increasing across the NFL because of Vic Fangio and Brandon Staley? Or do you think that there's other primary reasons that are contributing to this?
Yeah, I think this is so my philosophy I've always been, and obviously my site, my content is called Match Quarter, so you can kind of understand where my home base is, but I'm not dense enough to understand that there's not different coverages. Like what you're seeing now since 2020, really with the too high shells, is teams have always had cover three systems with quarters rule, like with quarters tools in them. They just have never done it from depth, right? And so I've always argued, and what I've always talked to schematically with players and other coaches is you really want the ball to be thrown behind the 5-yard line, right? Like I want it, and normally what you will hear the coach speak for that is no cover zone. So in typical defenses, you will have a no cover zone of anything under 5 yards. We're just going to zone off of that. I've always argued as well, we want the offense to throw negative routes. Negative routes mean any route behind the line of scrimmage. We want that to be thrown. And you look at how a lot of these defenses are being taught, how they're being kind of the technique behind it. You know, Fangio and ironically, I also call it a squat technique by these corners in these cover 2 schemes that we're starting to see is that you're actually going to carry a vertical. I think when people think cover 2, they think of Madden. So Madden is not played. Again, that's a computer, so it's not moving like a human being. So it's not played like that. It's not I have a circle. This is a flat. If it comes in, I'm going to nail down it. That's really a trap 2 coverage, and that's a hard cover 2. What we're seeing now is almost like a passive cover 2, where we're not going to let you throw to the intermediate. We're going to cloud the intermediate read because that's the easy throw. We're going to cap verticals, meaning that we're not going to give up fatals. We're not going to give up shot plays. We're not going to give up touchdowns, right? We're not going to give up the quick strike. What we're going to make you do, and we really saw this, I thought the 2021 Mahomes season, if you just go back and look at his heat map and his film, everybody just was like, screw it. You can throw 5-yard hitches and swing passes all you want, but we will not let you throw deep down the field. And I think when the correlation there schematically is we're seeing more throws in these no cover zones, negative throws behind the line of scrimmage, because that's the only thing that's there. I think that is why the 49ers are so good. They are the yak boys, right? Like yards after catch. Like there's a reason why they're good. They basically have a bunch of running backs. So I know running backs don't matter, but when you have them that can catch the pass and then make a move in space, like that does matter. And so I think what you're seeing is like, why is that offense so good? Well, they've got a lot of guys that can catch it at the 5 yards and then go. And they're not afraid to then combine that with the run game as you get in these light boxes in these situations where you're trying to really key in on the pass. They actually they really play with you with that 21 personnel.
Yeah. Cody, I'm going to put you on the spot totally here, and I apologize for doing this in advance. But, you think about how important Fangio's defense has been and how many people have that kind of seems to be the thing that's the most studied right now of trying to understand, wow, there's been a dramatic shift in the league. We're seeing kind of this shift. But we also know that, like, in many ways, the NFL is a copycat league. As one person starts to do something, other people get it, they'll innovate. And there's also a flow of ideas kind of upward. How many times we've seen a random crazy offense in high school turn into, oh, we're dominating the NFL now with spread concepts and all this, or at least into college football and up. Knowing that the Fangio influence on defense is so big, have you been able to isolate or even kind of identify some concepts that are common in the current NFL defensive landscape that have trickled in from other places, whether that be upward from college football or as kind of a response to the Fangio defense?
Yeah, I think to put context into Fangio, and it's been really every year I pick a defense I want to learn. Fangio this year, I've been writing about Fangio since 2020, but I really wanted to just nail down on all the basics of it. And I tweeted it out just at noon today, a cover six look of all the data from using coverage data, and quarters has been growing. If you want to find a link between college and the NFL, it's quarters. The Fangio system, though it is popular, the too high philosophy is what is catching on, not necessarily the coverage aspect. Now, I'm enamored by the coverage aspect, the way that he combines cover 2 with cover 4, and he's kind of flipped the script where they're running more cover 2 to the passing strength. In fact, I had somebody mention on my YouTube channel, they had talked to a former NFL quarterback, and he was like, that's not true. Everybody's still running quarters to passing strength. He's like, no, it's actually kind of flipped. But you look at the data, It has not grown as fast. Has it grown? Yes. Are more teams have the percentages gone up since 2018? Yes. But in terms of quarters has almost literally like quadrupled. I mean, like the percentage has gone. I think the percentage in 2018, 6% of the coverage calls in the NFL were quarters. Fast forward to this past season, 13%. So you've gone up 7 percentage points. That's a huge, huge deal in a league that has kind of been a dinosaur on defense for a long time. And why do I say 2018? 2018 is the year that broke football. That's the year that we had the basketball game played between Kansas City and the Rams. You have the Rams explosion. Mahomes enters the league. It broke the NFL. The spread was there. It had won in the college level. It had won at the high school level, but it won. Guys, we're in the post-spread era, guys. So it's like now we're all adjusting. But quarters, to go back to your original question, quarters is where you are seeing a lot of these guys start going to college staffs, bringing college staffs in and saying, okay, how are you teaching quarters? How are you adjusting to this? I mean, the Jets, for instance, ran like 75% quarters this year, and they had all these different tags. And so I'm watching it, and coverage data you take with a grain of salt, but you still can use it. You still can use it really to just see core, like how much just clear pictures of quarters are we getting? How much clear pictures of this are we getting? But I'm watching it and I'm like, man, this data point that I got is not right. I really think it's more. And then I found out that sure enough, 75% of it's quarters. Well, they're just using tags. So if you are live in the quarters world like I have forever, you watch it and you're like, yeah, they're running quarters. This is 100% clear, but it looks like cover three. So for offensive coordinators, because everything's from a too high shell, they really have no idea what's coming. That is where the Fangio philosophy is really won over, not necessarily his call structure.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point about quarters. And like, yeah, when you look at the data, you're right. Like the Jets led the league in quarters percent snaps last year, and then the Titans, really good defense, was second behind them, and then the Commanders, who surprisingly finished fifth in defensive EPA per play last year. I don't think a lot of people know that were fourth, but when you look at a defense like the Browns, who had the third most percent snaps in coverage of quarters last year, and a defense that struggled, from time to time throughout the season, what do you kind of see as like some fixes for a team like the Browns or like the Packers, who were both top 10 in usage of quarters, but maybe didn't have the results that these other teams that ranked highly in quarters usage had?
Yeah, your quarters is one of those where you've got to learn what works with it. At the NFL level, you're not going to get, it's called 9-man. The spacing is a very technical term, it's coaching terms. Really, a lot of times it's like I call it a bar trick. It's really just coach speak to show how smart you are. But 9-man spacing just means, like, if you're going to run regular quarters and you're going to run 9-man spacing, we're basically everybody's on the box, and then the corners are playing man outside. And so you don't have to do a lot up front. You don't have to stunt people. You don't have to do things. And so what I think happens when guys get into a quarter situation, they don't know how can I pair this in an unpredictable way. And so you end up getting guys actually, in fact, I did a conversation today with the coach about how your first year you run quarters, you're probably not going to be very good at it if you've never done it before. And it's one of those things that, like, a lot of guys will tell you, and I've said this before, it's pedagogy forward, like it's heavy on the front end, but man, on the back end, when you can start using your safety spokes and taking your backside safety and doing a bunch of different things, like now you've got a little bit more answers than you typically would if you're just like cover three, where you're basically slotted where you have to have guys. So to me, that, speaking about the Browns and the Packers, it's probably figuring out how can we maintain box integrity, how can we play off coverage, man, how can we flip up off and press and different things like that while also playing quarters, and just kind of figuring it out from there.
Yeah, and and a lot of that, Cody, I feel like, especially with like the first time coaches, is a little bit like the Wallace Shawn and the Princess Bride, where he's like, you know this, then I know this, then you know this, then I know this. And a lot of defense it's hard because it is reacting and it's saying, can I disguise this in a way that I'm not going to get exploited? But if an offense tries to exploit me, can I react and can I adapt and kind of overcome that? So it's certainly interesting to kind of see the pendulum back and forth and how people react. Cody, a couple more questions before we move on. Just want to mention, we've been talking about how difficult it is to be precise yet controlled and effective on the defensive side of the football in the NFL. I also want to talk about another area of your life where it's important to be precise and detailed and effective and controlled, and that is personal grooming. You can check out Manscaped. They have all of the male grooming accessories, equipment, technology that you need, high quality stuff, cutting edge, both literally and figuratively in terms of the quality of the technology and what they're doing over there. Code SUMER, SUMER, 20% off for manscaped.com for all your male grooming needs. Boom, we're in it, we're out of it, and it just we keep moving. So I think it's really interesting to look at that kind of back and forth, to look at how we understand defenses. That I have a little side question. I know Tage wants to get into some 2023 like specifics, so I'm going to let him drive after that. Cody, it's a lot easier for me to look at the offense and be like, okay, that's 3-by-1. I know they have leverage this way. I know that's a play action. That's an RPO. It's a lot harder to do that on the defensive side of the ball. Do you have a couple of maybe entry points or kind of low hanging fruit for people to watch football intelligently and move beyond, oh, that's too high, or, oh, that's cover 3, knowing that there's this cover 6, knowing there's other kind of coverages that are disguised as them, to raise the intelligence, raise the IQ of people as they're kind of watching football, knowing that defense is so much harder to parse than the offense?
Yeah, I think the very first thing that you need to understand is too high does not mean quarters. It doesn't mean cover 2. There can be a lot of different things. And single high doesn't mean that you're going to get cover 1 or cover 3. In fact, that's kind of the big trend in the NFL, and really at the college level, they call them NTTs or non-traditional Tampas, and looking single high and then coverage rotation to too high. Well, we're seeing, again, everybody's going too high, but it's still a cover 3 dominant system. So it's you know what we're going through. It's the same way when analytics will start looking at hand in the ground versus not in the ground. Is it a 3-4 or 4-3? And then eventually everybody just said, screw it, who cares? It's just kind of like, how many guys do you have on the line or around the box? And then that's just kind of it. And so we're getting to that point now in coverage that the pre-snap alignment does not mean what you're going to get. If you want to read it like a quarterback, you would start with the safety away from the nickel. So wherever the passing strength is, that would be the 2 receivers. If it's 2-by-2, because I know somebody's going to ask this, what if it's 4 open? Because 4 open looks in the NFL. It used to be only Cliff Kingsbury ran it. Now we're seeing that more and more. Typically what you will get, if it's not a dominant like a Waller or a Kelsey, you will get wherever the tight end is in a 4 open set. So wherever the tight end is, away from that is typically where your nickel is going to be. So the boundary safety, I call it boundary because of college, but and you typically that's usually a good way of doing it. But your weak safety, wherever he is, that's usually where the tell is going to come from. And that's usually where you can see the rotation happen first, especially from a 2-high shell. The reason why being in a 2-high shell and then snapping post-snap to different things is that quarterbacks are not taught to read the corner. And so the second step to that is, if you can't figure out what the coverage is, watch the corner technique. Primarily, if it's a by 1, a lot of times guys will teach like, look, if it's by 1, you're just playing man on that guy anyway. The corner to the passing strength will give you a really good tell of whether it's quarters. If it's quarters, he's trying to stay on top of the receiver in front of him. If it's cover 2, he's going to get in a trail technique. He's going to be a little bit more aggressive. He's going to get in a trail. And then if it's man, typically that's when you're going to see the press. He's going to lock on. And then you kind of have to look at how the nickel and the safety are working with each other. But if you're looking at film and you're like, I want to get better at reading coverage, always start with the weak safety. And then if you can't tell, move to the corners, because the corners are typically going to be the ones that will tell you as well.
Yeah, that's that's a great explanation. I appreciate you breaking that down, and I do really like mentioning the rotation from the safeties and how that can happen more frequently when these defenses are in two high shells, because something that I've looked at from a data perspective before is when a quarterback is under center on a play action fake, and there's a rotation from the safeties, usually the two high to single high rotation, their EPA per pass drops like at a pretty decent clip, just
Yeah.
because when they have to turn their back and relook at the defense after the play action, it's a totally different coverage than what they were seeing pre-snap. And when I think about like some of the biggest games, from like a schematic standpoint, I do come back to that Bears Rams 2018 game on Sunday Night Football, where this Rams offense was rolling and scoring 25, 30 plus points on every defense that they played that season. And then they got to Vic Fangio's Bears there, and Rams being a heavy play action team, and Fangio's defense being a heavy rotation team from the safety point, kind of really stifled the Rams offense and slowed them down, and then we've kind of seen like what has conspired from there. And I think that the version of that game for the 2022 season was Bengals Ravens, the wild card playoff game, where this Bengals offense was rolling and rattling off wins to close the season. And the Ravens defense under Mike McDonald being his first year defensive coordinator came into it a little bit banged up, but they were playing better after trading for Roquan Smith, and they really held the Bengals offense to only 2 offensive touchdowns, 17 offensive points total. And he was using simulated pressures to slow down the Bengals, and we know that the Bengals should have a counterattack for it. But can you kind of just walk us through like what made that Ravens defense kind of go out and kind of slow down the Bengals last year, and then like what could happen in that matchup when they play at least twice in this 2023 season?
Yeah, I thought they did 2 things with their coverage that I thought was really interesting. When they wanted to run cover 3, they ran almost, I call it a swipe coverage. I come from, Phil Bennett is an old Rex Ryan guy, so the Bear 46 swipe coverage, it cut, if you know anything, cut. So the seam players weren't really playing vertically on the seam. They were literally cutting to the outside receiver, especially if you had like Chase on the outside. So what they were doing was they were cutting the low route, because what are you going to get when you run cover 3? You're going to get hitches, you're going to get slants, you're going to things underneath of the corner, because that's where the soft spot is. So they were actually cutting those overhangs. So they were getting an athlete on an athlete and then an athlete on top. So they were getting their safety, their nickel underneath the number 1 receiver, but also capping him vertically. Inside, they were just basically getting what I call vertical hooks. So they were taking their hook defenders and they were just running them in a vertical column. They almost looked like they were just backpedaling. There wasn't a lot of match, because they felt like, and this has kind of been the MO for the Bengals the past couple of seasons, is just the offensive line just is not great. So that's where the simulated pressure comes in, is that they kind of have an idea. In fact, it's funny, I've watched the Bengals now for several years on offense, and it's kind of like the Bengals pressure is that weak side B gap that they will just, I don't know how they haven't figured it out. But if you pressure that B gap to the weak side, that thing opens up like the Red Sea half the time, and Burrow gets sacked. And so the typical term in the NFL is called whip. So, it's called a whip pressure. And so, the Ravens call it Baker because it hits the B gap. They'll just tag it and then call it Baker, and then it hits the B gap. And so all you get is a DN vertical, tackle sets. They flood everybody. They kind of grab the offensive line, and this huge B gap section opens up, and they hit them. And what they're doing is when they're dropping out that D lineman, is that he's actually playing vertical. A lot of NFL guys play what's called a bonus fire zone, and most people know fire zone is 3 under 3 deep. It's basically cover 3, but you don't have that extra hook player. And so they just pedaled him back. I mean, and that's the other thing with the Ravens. They have such athletic defensive ends that they can actually play some match coverage, or at least zone match coverage in their cover 3. So they were cutting outside, and then they were getting these vertical hooks. And then all it was basically having him sit there. The other thing that they did is that they would they were running some non-traditional Tampas, meaning that they would give you the illusion of single high. So Burrow pre-snap thinks, okay, I'm getting single high. I know I got to match up in these places. And then all of a sudden the corners are hard. They're beating up the receiver. I'm getting a rotation post snap. I'm getting cover 2. So all of our cover 3 stuff now, all of our cover 3 beaters are now running into cover 2, which is screwing everything. And so now I'm holding the ball. So all they're trying to do, and I thought the Ravens did a really good job of it, is just, and again, McDonald coming from the college level, understanding that I just need to keep the drive alive. I just need to keep the drive alive. I need to keep it going, because if we can get to 10 to 12 to 15 plays, there's going to be a mistake made. And I think that it's so opposite of what you would have heard 10 years ago. Everybody was all about 3 and outs. We need 3 and out. I mean, I just remember as a kid, it's all about the 3 and outs. We want to have this amount of 3 and outs. We want to come out in the half and have this 3 and out. And it's really proven that 3 and out really doesn't do anything. And so it does have an effect on the game, but if you get a bunch of them, if you're getting a bunch of them, that means you're just better than they were. But what you need is, if you can at least sustain a long drive, that they have to earn it. That you are increasing your chance for a turnover. You're increasing your chance for a sack. You're increasing your chance for a tackle for loss. Something bad is going to happen. And so that's really the mentality that you see. And I think it's really interesting. A lot of these younger coordinators are taking that approach, because look, I'm 37. So anybody that's around, probably 35 to 45, they grew up in pretty much the pre-spread era where everybody played 7-on-7. You probably had played some sort of spread in college. You definitely had to defend it at some point if you were coaching college or high school. So it's like everybody's kind of used to it now. And so I think they understand a little bit better than these other coaches of like, look, we'll let you run the ball a little bit. And then we're just going to make these, you're going to have to sustain a drive. And I don't think people understand how hard it is for an offensive coordinator to call 15 plays in a row to try and get into the red zone. And then the quarterback to execute that, especially in a league where there's really only about 4 or 5 elite quarterbacks that can, you just don't want them passing the ball all the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love how you mentioned kind of the philosophical shift in going from 3 and outs to, trying to just increase these drives and hoping for variance to break your way. Now, I remember like 10 years ago when Chip Kelly's like Oregon teams, especially those offenses were could score on almost every drive. Their like defensive strategy would be to just kind of like heavy blitz on first down, because either they get the sack and they basically like end the drive for good, or they let up the explosive play and let the other team score, which is fine because like they were probably going to score anyways. But like it's interesting to see now like how that shift has kind of happened. And I do think that, like you mentioned, like Mike McDonald being a young defensive coordinator, first year in the league, is like he's already shown that he's like a really sharp guy. And like we can, moving on to like another defensive coordinator that's has had 1 year of defensive coordinator experience in Chicago, but this is really where the first time we're going to get to see his real defense, because he's working with some really talented players. Is Sean Desai in Philadelphia this year, where taking over for Jonathan Gannon last year. I think Gannon got some criticism for running like a relatively vanilla defense, which it worked fine last year because they ranked highly in efficiency metrics. But how do you see Desai's influence, coming from the Fangio tree, as well as spending a year with Pete Carroll in Seattle and learning more, of the cover 3 tree there, kind of mixing together and affecting Philly's defense this year?
Yeah, I think Raheem Morris is probably a good place to start with what a meshing of the two might look like. I do not want to don't understate Carl Scott being in Seattle. What is the big difference between Staley and Fangio? Staley leans more towards the Saban man match concepts, whereas Fangio is more of a zone match, kind of a looser coverage. So I think like you look at that. Maybe what the Broncos did last year is probably an even better place to start. Now, this defense in particular, if you look at press rates, is always in the bottom of the league. And then you looked at what Evero did with the Broncos last year. When you have two on-ball corners like Surtain and Mathis, you play them on ball. So it will be interesting to see what he learned, what he pulled from the cover 3 toolbox from Pete Carroll, because he is Mr. Cover 3. I think you look at all the dominant cover 3 schemes in the NFL, Legion of Boom, all that stuff comes from that. But then he's also got that Fangio background. And the thing that I think people don't understand is that NFL, these coaches don't live in vacuums. So they actually talk to each other. And they meet in the offseason. And I know I know your favorite team is talking to an opponent's defensive coordinator. I know that's crazy, but that is true. That's how this works. And so they're constantly communicating. I'm sure they all communicate with Fangio. I'm sure Desai called Fangio and said, hey, what are some things that you thought that they could have done better last year, that we could have done better last year, or that you heard from that? So, I mean, again, these guys are all talking. I think what you're going to see is a lot of the same front elements that you saw last year, but I think the coverages are going to be different. I thought it was really interesting. Yes, Fangio was a consultant for the Eagles for much of the year, but Gannon really was his self in terms of the way that he called coverages. Did they have some Fangio influence? Yes, but he was very much more of a quarters than he was kind of that cover 6, that half quarter cover 8 is what Fangio calls it, system. So I think that you will see a Fangio system. I think that you'll get kind of what you see in the Rams, kind of what you see with the Chargers, and then obviously what you're going to get with the Panthers as well.
Yeah, I'm whittling down the potential follow-ups there because I'm looking at our time and I want to be respectful of yours, Cody, and appreciate you being on here. I think that we had a couple of questions you want to get in, like specifics of teams, and I think what I'm going to say is I'm going to direct people to your Twitter at @the_coach_A, and Robert Wolf, I think, asked a couple of detailed questions, and I think I would push him to your Twitter as well because I don't know that we'll be able to cover those on the with the time we have. What I do want to ask you, and kind of one of our last questions here, is there have been a lot of defenses in the NFL that have retooled. There have been a couple that are kind of reloaded. You look at like what the Cowboys have added. You look at, the Patriots actually finished the season on kind of a heater on defense and added Christian Gonzalez and Keon White, like looked pretty good. Is there a defense that you have circled as maybe under the radar, or potentially going to have a breakout season from the combination of they added a couple good pieces? I like what they've done schematically. Maybe they had some bad luck last year. Anybody on your radar like that for 2023 in terms of who some of the best defenses should be, not just in terms of efficiency, but in terms of innovation, running compelling stuff, challenging offenses?
Yeah, I thought so. I started watching the Commanders, and if they can hit on their corner that they got in the first round, I know a lot of people were a little concerned with his size. He's a little frail. But if you're running quarters, you're really playing a lot of man, and so a long corner that can run is something that's going to be really good for you. So they're a team with the interior that they have. If they can get Young to hit and be healthy and finish a season, I mean, that's a unit that you look at. Linebackers are not as important as they used to be, but that secondary is really kind of intact. They've added 2 pieces. I think in the first and second round, they added 2 pieces. I think their starting nickel and one of their starting corners opposite Fuller is going to be their starters. So if they can kind of have the success that like the Bills had with their drafted corner, the Chiefs are another example of hitting on these guys. I think that if they can do that, that is a surprise team. When I was studying them, I kept thinking, I was like, if their offense can put anything together, that might be the dark horse team that you're like, because there's always one in the NFL that comes out of nowhere and makes the playoffs. That to me is a team that I think can surprise some people that have not been like, you look at it. And I mean, they snuck in. I mean, they were one of the top defenses in the league and no one talked about them. Mm-hmm. And I think a story that nobody's talking about is kind of the evolution of Jack Del Rio. I mean, Del Rio, I was in his office with him and Fox when they were with the Broncos talking about zone read. They didn't know how to defend zone read. This is RG3 had just shown up. Kaepernick was killing it with the 49ers. And so it was like his evolution of just, I'm a very big cover 3 guy. And then all of a sudden now we're going to run more cover 2 in these 2 high shells. I think that's guys his age and that have been in the NFL and that are like, I mean, dude, he's a staple. He's an NFL guy, right? Like when you said Del Rio, it's like, dude, when was he not in the NFL? So when you have a guy like that show you that you're going to change, I think that should be something that should really kind of put the I need to watch them and see if they do that. That would be my team that I feel like can surprise some people.
Yeah, I love the Commanders pick. Again, like we mentioned earlier, like finished top 5 in a lot of defensive metrics last year, especially second half of the season, playing a lot better. And then, what you talked about with adding Forbes to play their other outside corner, adding Martin in the second round to play their nickel position. And then like if you can get 80%, 90% of Chase Young from his rookie year when he won Defensive Rookie of the Year, and like considering how highly of a draft pick he was, like I think that's a really exciting defense because the Commanders are really good in spots you want to be good at, really, really stout defensive line, and then like a secondary that they've just taken a lot of shots at, like we've seen successful defenses like the Buccaneers or the Eagles do the past couple of years, where you just keep throwing darts at that secondary and eventually some of those corners are going to hit. So I'm glad you mentioned the Commanders as a sneaky team to finish as a top defense.
Well, and I'll say this last, their interior D line, if you're going to be a 4-down quarters team, you got to have stout interior D line because they're basically going to have to play gap and a half. Which is like 7-man spacing. So if you're going to be moving and playing gap and a half, that's what you want. And they, like you said, their defensive personnel actually fits what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and that max, I think that match is underappreciated. I know because I watch a lot more college, but I know in the NFL as well. Of like, we have a good game plan. We might not have the right guys to do this game plan. Can we adapt? And so when it joins together, I think it's underrated for how well that does.
Yeah.
Cody, we look at the time again. I could keep you on here for an hour and a half. We won't do that to you. Thanks so much for being here today. That's Cody Alexander, a veritable font of wisdom about defense at all levels of football and an all-around nice guy. Definitely go follow him on Twitter at _coach_A, Match Quarters on Substack. Cody, we're at 6 books now total?
6, yes.
My goodness. Is there a 7th one in the works?
Not right now. They kind of come through inspiration. And so, this last one I wanted to put together, how can you marry the 4-down? Because that's what we're really seeing, especially at the college level, as you've noticed. I mean, Georgia's essentially become a 4-down quarters team. And so how do you mesh this tight front philosophy that you've had since the past 5 years? How do you build this back into a 4-2-5? Well, that was kind of the inspiration for that book. But yeah, I'm up to 6 books, and then obviously I'm got 2 articles a week on the Substack.
Well, you mentioned J.K. Rowling at the beginning of the show and her Harry Potter writing. She had 7 books with Harry Potter, right? So one more to get to a full series right there, right?
Oh, yeah. That's great. Go check Cody out. I'll read all his books. I own multiple of his books, and I am a subscriber to his Substack. So that's a personal recommendation for me. Go check that out. Cody, thanks so much for being here. For my colleague Tej Seth, for our guest Cody Alexander, I am Parker Fleming. This has been the SumerSports Show. We'll be back not Monday. I think we're going to be holiday, so we'll be back next Wednesday with another guest chatting. Me and Tej. Maybe something on Friday. Tej, we haven't talked about that yet, but who knows what'll pop up on this channel. Make sure you're subscribed to get all the best content from SumerSports regarding the NFL and analytics. With that, we're out of here.